Thanks to all of you for being here today. I've kind of divided in my old age the world into two kinds of people, the kind who care and the kind who don't care. And I found that the kind of people who don't care don't get involved in safety because they don't care. The kind of people who do care can change the world. And it's an honor and a privilege to work with the people who care for all of these years. Thank you for all that you do to try to keep other people safe. It's an incredible thing. How many of you thought that Duncan was a native Texan? He kind of had that accent, right? But if you thought that, you should be completely dispelled by that, by the fact that his first association with cowbells was Switzerland. 50 years ago, you could find more cowbells within a 50-mile radius of right here than you could in all of Switzerland for the last 100 years. But anyway, that being that, I am a native Texan. I'm very proud of being a native Texan. I haven't lived here all my life. I was born here, dragged all over the world by a military father, and then brought back. That is why I'm not a long, tall Texan, because I did all my formative years overseas. So anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Has nothing to do with the fact that my father's 6'2" and my mother's 5 foot nothing. You know. Anyway, thanks for being here, and thanks for all that you do in safety. Got a question to ask you. How many of you have ever rented a car? How many of you detailed it or had it detailed before you turned it back in? Why not? How many of you have ever detailed or had detailed your own car? What's the difference? You own it. You know, I got this topic, interestingly enough, from one of my first helicopter experiences. I was in Point Barrow, Alaska, and I was getting on a helicopter to go to an offshore rig out there, and they handed me the smallest life jacket I've ever seen in my life. And I looked at the pilot and I said, "Would this thing really save your life?" And he said, "Oh no." He said, "If you go in the water, you're dead." He said, "But it would help us to recover your body for your family." Yeah. So I kind of got the feeling of what it was like up there. And I questioned over the period of time that I was up there, this pilot and co-pilot of this copter, and I said, "How do you know you're not going in the water?" And they said, "Oh, we're not going in the water." And I said, "How do you know that?" And they said, "Because we make sure. We do everything that we have to do to make sure that we're not going in the water." And I said, "So you have confidence in your safety program?" He looked me in the eye and he said, "We own our safety program. It's ours. It's us. It's for us. By us." Yes, we have every confidence in it because we own it. So here's the thing. What does ownership do? Where does it come from? How do you establish it? By the way, one other thought, and the theme of the conference is, where do you start? And I would like to suggest right up front here that there's no universal answer to that question. Because I've worked with so many organizations over the years. I've started at top down, I've started at bottom up, and I've started at middle out. And the reason I did that is because that's the way it fit that organization the best. No two organizations, no two cultures that I've ever worked with are identical. They all have these unique characteristics, and if you work with those characteristics, that's how you have your greatest success. Just the gospel according to Terry Mathis. An interesting story about this. Back in, right after the Russian Revolution, right after World War I, the communists took over the country and they owned all the property. There was no private ownership of property in Russia at all. And they assigned farmers to farm large sections of land, and everything that they produced on these large sections of land belonged to the government and was shared by the people and everything. They almost starved to death. And someone pointed out that these Russian farmers were historically peasant farmers. They raised their own gardens and things like that to eat from and everything. So they acquiesced their socialistic tendencies just a little bit, and they gave small tracts of land to each of the farmers who were farming these huge tracts of land for the state. The next year, the very next year, those tracts of land, which were less than 0.75% of the total arable soil, produced 75% of the crops in the country. Now, why does somebody tend their own little garden better than they do a huge state-owned farm? They own it, and it's theirs. It answers that universal, what's in it for me question. Have you ever thought about that? I've had people say, "Terry, that's an awfully selfish question." No, that's a totally human question. Don't you ask it to yourself, either consciously or subconsciously? Every time something new comes along, you say, "How's it going to impact me? What's in it for me? How would I benefit from it, or how would I suffer from it?" Okay? So, what is ownership all about? There are several words that I associate with this over there, but it's the feeling that something is really yours. Now, it doesn't have to be yours. You don't have to have a title to it, like you do a car or something like that. You can feel a sense of ownership a number of different ways, by possession, but by stewardship also. What if you're in charge of it? What if this is your baby? You're the one that goes out there and makes it happen. Just like those helicopter pilots who said, we own safety. Guess what? You know, they felt that deep sense that we're talking about over here. And control. Control is another thing. And I wanted to ask you today, do your people really feel like they possess safety? Do they feel like that's their stewardship? And do they feel like they have some modicum, at least, of control over what is said? So this is kind of the ownership question. Who owns safety in your organization? Is it something that people take deep pride in and detail on a regular basis and keep it sparkly and shiny? Or is it something you loan to them when they come to work and they get to turn it in dirty at the end of their shift? You know, so many safety programs are not owned by the people who practice it. It's given to them. It's provided to them. It's a rental car. And that's the reason that you don't get this deep involvement in it that you're looking for. So how do you create a sense of ownership? Well, how does ownership emerge? Again, it can come from control. If people are put in a little bit of control of what they say, or even if they have input, even if it's not control, if it's just input, when people have an intimate knowledge of how something works, they tend to feel a deeper sense of ownership. I recently, one of my client companies interviewed 100 workers, and I asked them, what is your internalized definition of safety? I got 85 different answers. Now, if people don't even think of safety the same way, how are they going to work synergistically together to make it happen? So one of the things I wanted to challenge you to do here today, and I should have put it in my slides, I always think of these things as we go. That's why I try not to have to send my slides ahead of time, because I could have put it in right there at the table about 5 minutes ago. But one of the things that I advise my clients to do is to have a definition of safety. I wrote a book on safety culture that I've got a copy of over there on the table, and it's called Steps to Safety Culture Excellence. STEPS is an acronym. It stands for Strategic Targets for Excellent Performance in Safety. You know what I find the major mistake that my clients are making? That call me in and say, Terry, why are we not progressing any faster than we are? They're trying to do too much at once. They didn't break this down into bite-sized pieces. Well, you've all heard the old adage, right? How do you eat an elephant? You know, a bite at a time. You try to eat the whole elephant at once, you choke to death, and you tick off the elephant. And both of those are bad. You know, you don't want a ticked-off elephant in your mouth while you're choking to death, you know. So how do you do that? And I started to use that BITES acronym like that, but I really like this one. You know, there's an old Chinese proverb that says even a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So I'm going to suggest to you that the basic competency you can have in your culture, if you really wanted to take ownership for safety, is the ability to target a specific improvement, make it, and move on to another one. I think that is the very basic. But if they don't not even in agreement on what safety is, they're not going to work together that way. It just won't happen. So what else can do this? Self-investment. If people are invested in safety, they feel a sense of personal pride in what's going on over there. That makes a big difference too. But you know what the average safety program is I'm called in to look at? Management came up with it, handed it to the workers and said, here, go do this. W. Edwards Deming, one of the men that I've studied and worshiped most of my life, said people support what they help create. You know, all the little adages I've internalized over the years, that's probably the one most useful one. People support what they help create. Every time I've done something and didn't have the level of support that I wanted, I could look back and see where I'd missed opportunities to let people have creative input into that. So do you do that in safety? One of the other things, what is your management style? You know, I have several people right now who worship what they call the Bradley curve. I'm going to give a talk on this at National Safety Council coming up by the end of this month. And basically, I've defined the Bradley curve as a blatant ripoff of poor deceased Stephen Covey's idea that someone took and applied to safety and put their name on it out there. It says that you should take your culture from dependent to independent to interdependent. Let me tell you something. If your management style is command and control, you're not going to take that culture anywhere. They're going to stay right there at that dependent side. You know, I had a supervisor many years ago say, Terry, my workers won't do anything unless I tell them to do it. He said, they'll come to me and they'll say, what's next, boss? And I said, when they come to you and say, what's next, boss, what do you do? He says, I tell them what's next. I said, what if you ask them what's next? What if you got them thinking and set that expectation? You want them to think on their own. Now you're taking them from dependent to independent, right? Now, the interdependent, that's a whole different thing over there. I have a different set of phrases for it too. But one of the things that I find is that a lot of safety professionals are safety cops. And COP, I made an acronym out of this. Actually, Sean Galloway did. He said it's catching opportunities to punish. You're looking for somebody doing something wrong, and you're going to make them quit doing something wrong. You know, it's this whole negative definition of safety that we have out there. Actually, ask you a deeper question. In safety, really being honest with yourself, are you trying to achieve success or avoid failure? What are your metrics? How many of you have a goal to have a lower recordable rate this year than you did last year? That's not success, that's failing less. Okay? Now, one of the reasons we do that is because we measure. All our metrics are failure metrics. The number of accidents, the ratio of accidents, the cost of accidents, they're all failure metrics. They're all things that we didn't want to have. So what's the alternative to being a safety cop? It's being a safety coach. And what I have found in the organizations that I work with, when you create ownership, change happens. When people feel a deep sense of ownership. And how do they feel that? By being a member of a team. And what does the team have to be successful? A coach. Did any of you watch the game last night? I picked up a little bit of it on television before I dozed off last night. My estimate right there, one team got out-coached. One coach was better than the other. The teams were doggone amazingly equal, playing each other out there. Some incredibly talented people on both teams, but one coach outperformed the other coach, and they won by a few points last night. So, are you a safety coach or are you a safety cop? If you want ownership, you need to be a coach. And I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to share with some other people a little more in depth over here, a model of coaching that I really like. I call it focus, feedback, and facilitate, and it needs to go in that order. How many of you feel like you give meaningful feedback to your workers on their safety performance? Ooh, there's a telling's tale. One of the things I want to suggest to you, feedback is incredibly artificial unless you focus first. I'd like to give you some feedback on how you're sitting in that chair out there right now. This is going to be my opinion versus yours, right? You know where opinion battles go. You know, they go from I think it's safe and I don't to I think you're ugly and your mom's dresses you funny. You know, those kind of fruitful discussions like that. So why do you need to focus before you give feedback? Well, I learned this lesson very hard from a famous psychologist that I worked with out of Boston back years ago. He used to come to my house for a couple of weeks. I'd go to his house for a couple of weeks, and we were working on this project. And one day he dropped me off at the airport, and he said, Terry, I feel compelled to tell you something. What's that? And he said, yeah, you're being very negative with your son. He said, I've seen you tell him things he's not doing well. I haven't heard you give him any positive reinforcement. He said, you know, if you become his critic rather than his coach, you're going to lose your influence with him. He's going to quit listening to you because all you say is the negative. He said, you know how to give positive reinforcement. Catch him doing something right and give him the way to go, attaboy, good job, everything like that. So I decided, I dedicated myself on the way home that I'm going to catch my son doing something right and give him some positive reinforcement. 3 weeks later, I'm waiting for the stinking kid to do something right. You know, you can't start with feedback, you got to start with focus. So I challenged him, would you do this? Would you help me with this? And he says, okay, Dad, and guess what? The next day he's doing it. The basic skill of a culture, the capability of a culture you want is the ability to target a specific improvement in safety, make it, and move on. How many people want to get better this year than you were last year in safety? Guess how you do it? A step at a time. You can't do it all at once. You can't push the mountain an inch. You got to dig something out of this side of the mountain, haul it around to the other side, and dump it over there if you're going to move that over there. And this is what this coaching model helps you to do. This last part over here, facilitate. Anybody speak Spanish? God, you're in Texas. You really ought to speak Spanish. You know? Can't live in Texas, I don't think, anymore without speaking Spanish. The first part of this word, which is a Latin base, by the way, F-A-C-I-L, means easy. Fácil in Spanish. It's easy. So what do you do when you facilitate? You make it easy for people to be safe. So what if someone's using the wrong tool for the job, and you give them some feedback and say, I'm concerned you're using the wrong tool for the job, and then you do this radical thing I'm going to suggest, ask them why. And they say, well, the right tool for the job's located too far away from where I have to use it. How do you facilitate? Maybe you move the tool, right? Maybe you get them a little closer to the work area, whatever it is. So if you don't know why, you don't know how to facilitate. And this is a powerful little model. You know, we've been attempting to control people for years and years. They attempt to control people here in Texas with these things called speed limit signs out there. They're terribly ineffective. They don't slow anybody down very much at all out here. In fact, there was a cartoon, a joke in the Dallas Morning News not too long ago, where a highway patrolman in Texas, we call him DPS, it's the Department of Public Safety, he's stopping somebody and he's saying, the guy says, why did you stop me? I was going the speed limit. He said, you're in Texas. You have to go at least 15 above the speed limit. Go back to where you came from, you know? Anyway, it was all a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's not all that much. Guess how effective speed limits and giving tickets for violators has been in slowing America down over the last 20 years? It's almost counterproductive. We got more speeders now than we did before we were doing all that. There's a number of reasons for that. So rather than trying to control people, what if you target specific improvements? What if you took a look at your accident data and said, what type of accident's happening the most often? Why is it happening? What precaution could prevent it? And you go to your workers and you say, would you all help us to do this? I was working with a company called American Infrastructure out of Philadelphia. They build most of the highways down the I-95 corridor over there and the bridges and everything else over there. And the president of the company, after we did an analysis of his accident data, got on with an all-hands meeting. There's a lot of people joining him electronically and everything. And he said, how many times a day do we get onto or off of a piece of equipment? People are going, oh, wow, thousands, tens of thousands, everything like that. He says, why can't we be perfect at that? He says, now, you folks, you get on and off of cranes, you get on and off of half-ton pickups, you get on and off of front loaders and everything like that. I want you to form teams, and I want you to say, how can we get onto and off of this equipment with injury-free, totally injury-free? One challenge from the head honcho of the company, and guess what? They had a 55% reduction in their accident rate over the next 6 months. Now, it was interesting because only 49% of their accidents happened when they were getting onto and off of equipment. But guess what? There was some spillover. People weren't just thinking about that aspect of safety, they were thinking about safety in general. And it happens that way very often. I suggest, and I actually did and kind of perfected an accident prevention kind of Pareto. Safety professionals have been using Pareto analysis for a long, long time. And but most of you who are safety professionals or who look at your safety data can tell me the type of accident that happens the most often. Is it a trip and fall? Is it a fall from height? Is it a struck by? I bet you can also tell me what part of the body is injured most often. How many of you can tell me what precaution, if your workers took, would historically have prevented the most accidents over the last 3 years? So is your goal to analyze and categorize your accidents, or is it to prevent them? So we take a look at generic prevention strategies, things that you can do, and we do this Pareto analysis of your accident data over the last 3 years. You know what we generally find? Exactly what Pareto told us we would find. We find a significant few and a trivial many. And you know the one easiest thing you can do to improve safety, the best of anything, you can take your emphasis off those significant few and put off those trivial many and put it on the significant few. It's flu season right now. What one thing, if you do it, will prevent you from catching the flu most effectively of anything? Washing your hands, absolutely. What's number 2? The flu shot. Now, why does washing your hands protect you better than the flu shot? Because in any given year, there are 5 to 7 strains of the flu out there, and the flu shot only protects you against 1 or maybe 2 of them. So if you get exposed to one of these strains of the flu that the flu shot's not aimed at that year, which is, by the way, the CDC's best guess of what's going to be the most prevalent out there that year, it doesn't protect you. When you wash your hands, all 7 to 9 strains of that flu go right down the drain. My wife's a PhD nurse, and I asked her this question many years ago before I understood this principle. I said, I've caught the flu a couple of years in a row. How do I keep from it? She said, well, I'll tell you, but you'll probably say it's silly and simple and you won't do it. And I said, I promise if it's simple, I'll do it. And she told me about washing your hands. And I said, well, you're right. That's ridiculous. The soap in the bathroom won't kill the flu virus anyway. She smiles at me and her knowing nurse smile and says, you don't have to kill it. Just get it off your hands. I hate it when she disagrees with me and she's right. You know, it's just one of those things. And Anyway, she explained to me how this whole thing works. By the way, if you want to know how much my wife knows about medicine, my kids used to come and ask me medical questions. And I'd say, why didn't you ask your mother? And they said, I didn't want to know that much about it. So, sometimes you have to get to the right person to get the right information like that. So here's the thing I want to suggest to you. Excellence must be preceded with clear expectations. How many of your workers could draw a roadmap of where you want to go in safety? How many of your workers could say, okay, we're going to accomplish this, and then this, and then this, and then this? And they have a very clear picture of where they're going. Now, why do you want a roadmap? What's your first inclination when you feel lost? You ever been out in the woods on a hike or something like that, and you get to a point and you say, ooh, I don't know where I am. What's your first inclination? Isn't it to turn around and go back to where you knew where you were? Guess what happens in organizational change when people feel lost? They turn around and undo your organizational change. If everybody's not clear on where you're going and why you're going there, they're going to undo a lot of your good intentions out there. Feedback, this is an interesting thing. Feedback is really good at helping you to identify blind spots. And guess what blind spots most people have? There's two of them. One is you're simply on the wrong side of your own eyeballs. You're looking from the inside out. You can't see yourself as clearly as somebody else can see you. The other one is a blind spot called habits. Habits are things you do so automatically you may not even realize you do them. And your subconscious mind, where habits happen, does not have a search engine. Ask yourself, what are my habits? And don't wait too long because your brain's not going to tell you anything back. Or your conscious brain's going to try to go through that and say, well, what do I do that way? My youngest son was taking driver's ed a few years ago, and he bummed a ride off of me. I dropped him off. He sticks his head in the window and says, thanks for the ride, Dad. By the way, did you know you don't come to a complete stop at stop signs? I said, sure I do. And he says, no, you don't. See ya. Guess what just happened to me? I just got coached. I just got some feedback on my own performance, and somebody pointed out something that had crept into my behavior so subtly over so many years that I didn't even realize it would happen. But when I started checking myself, I found I do stop at some stop signs, but not all of them. If I can really see and it's really clear and I feel confident going out there, I'll roll the stop sign. But if you had asked me that, I'd have told you no. Because in my conscious mind, I still have that driver's ed class that I took. By the way, here's a telling one in Texas. When I was a kid, Texas was new. God told me He had just created it. Anyway, if you took driver's ed and if you made a B or better, you could get your driver's license on your 14th when you were 14. So on my 14th birthday, having taken driver's ed over the summer, I went and got my driver's license, and I've had it for the 175 years since. So I've had it out there a long time. But you get these little blind spots. You think you do something a certain way, and someone points it out that you don't. Interesting thing that's going on right now. Can feedback change behavior as effectively as punishment? I've worked with, I can't tell you how many, road construction crews, bridge builders, pavers, people like that, and they'll tell you the number one risk that they have out there on their job is traffic coming through their construction zone. And they used to tell me that the number one thing to slow that traffic down would be a police car with the lights flashing. That would slow people down very effectively. They're doing an experiment right now. It's 3 years into it, and they're putting up these radar signs out there. And the radar sign says basically the speed limit through this construction zone is 45, and you're going 54, 42, whatever it is like that. You know what's happening? These things are slowing people down more effectively than the police cars in the studies that they've done. Now, I've got a sneaking suspicion that other people like me have figured out there's not a cop in the car. They've just rented the car and turned the lights on and set it out there. But, even at that, feedback on performance is an incredibly powerful thing. How well are you doing? Any of you familiar with the old Hawthorne studies? They called the Hawthorne effect. Everything. Basically, they found out that just measuring something can make it better. People will actually try to drive the metric, if they have a metric, knowing how they're doing. So, facilitation, the third part of this model over here. An interesting thing that we're just now learning really as a society, there are 5 books that have been on the business bestseller list over the last 5 years that have the word influence somewhere in their title or subtitle. Guess what we're discovering? People do things for a reason. Now, you may not agree with the reason. You may not think that's the logic you would have used, but people do things for a reason. And here's the thing. If you don't change the reason, you might not change what they do. So guess what the futility of being the safety cop and going out there and saying, hey, dummy, don't do it like that. What if all the factors out there in the workplace are shaping the way they were doing it that you don't want them to do anymore? Even if you browbeat that one person into doing it against everything else out there, what happens when they go home and someone takes their shift? All those factors work on them. So we are learning that to truly facilitate safety, we have to not just work with people, we have to work with the logic of people, the rationale of why they do what they do, and that's becoming called more and more influence. So this is a little model, and Dan Peterson, who is a great friend of mine, beat me to death over using this model because he insists there are 9 categories of why people do that. James Reason, who I worked with at Alcoa, he says he's written 5 books on human error. I told him he's written the same book 5 times, but that was an argument between James and I. He's got 44 categories of why people make mistakes and why they do things. By the way, you know the difference between a slip and a lapse? I don't remember either. But anyway, James thinks that's an important thing. My goal is not to classify mistakes, classify errors that can lead to accidents, it's to fix them. So what if you see somebody doing something that you think is risky and you tell them you're concerned? What does the word concern connotate to you? That you care, yeah, absolutely so. Now, have you ever heard the old adage that nobody cares how much you know unless they know how much you care? You know, why are you out there? To show how much smarter you are about safety than them? Or are you out there because you care about them? I'm concerned. Why do you do that way? And your answers you're going to find are going to fall into, you can classify them into 4 categories. And I call these perceptions, habits, obstacles, and barriers. So I see somebody using the wrong tool for the job, and I say, I'm concerned. Why are you using this tool instead of that one or whatever like that? And they say, what's the big deal, Terry? I've done that 1,000 times. I've never gotten hurt. Guess what they just demonstrated to me? They don't understand the concept of low probability risks. By the way, that's one of these advanced strategies I'm going to talk about this afternoon too. You know, a lot of companies get rid of all their high probability risks and they can't figure out why they can't get rid of the others. Because they're a whole different category. They're low probability risks. People don't do those accidentally. They do them on purpose and think they're going to turn out okay, and one time in 500 they don't. By the way, if you believe National Safety Council statistics, the average person who gets hurt at work is taking a 1 in 500 risk. Guess why they don't recognize it? Because their perception of risk is based on their own personal experience. So if they've done it 300 times and haven't gotten hurt, they think it's going to be okay the next 200 times. The other one is sometimes you go past that conscious choice like that and you get into the subconscious choice over here, and I call it a habit. I think almost everybody knows what a habit is, right? It's something you just do automatically. You don't think about it. You don't rationalize it each time. I've finally gotten in the habit of buckling my seatbelt. I have no more deep philosophical conversations. To buckle or not to buckle. Just going to go click, you know? So when you form a habit, like habits can serve you very well or they can harm you deeply because they become so automatic in what you do. Now, what if on the other hand, I ask somebody, I'm concerned, why do you do that? And they say it's difficult or it's impossible because of, now I've got an obstacle or a barrier. Obstacles make it difficult, barriers make it impossible. Duncan mentioned I work with the military. I've done a lot of work with the Navy. I was at what they call the Fleet Readiness Center for the Atlantic Squadron of the Navy. It's at Cherry Point, North Carolina. There are, I believe, 5 or 6 bases out there. I'm in a Marine air station, and I'm walking through this hangar. There's 42 Marine aircraft mechanics. They're working on basically the same kind of bird everywhere, so a whole lot of them have the same drawer of their toolbox open. I see a homemade spanner wrench in every one of those drawers that's open. So I go to the head of the shop and I said, hey, Chief, how come you guys are all using homemade spanner wrenches? He said, I didn't know they were. I'm not even sure how to find out. And I said, come on, I'll show you how to find out. We walk up to a Marine and I say, hey, Marine, how come you're using a homemade spanner wrench? Any of you Marines? Okay, you know I had to get through the who the hell are you and what okay, you know that part. Well, after we got past that part, this Marine says, well, you see the tool cage over there and you see the 3 people in line at the window? Want to go stand in line and see if it's your lucky day? They got 2 of them in there, and all 42 of us need it at the same time. Now, guess why a bunch of highly trained, highly motivated Marine aircraft mechanics are using the wrong tool for the job? Because they're dumbass Marines, right? They weren't trained properly. Let's send them back for retraining. Let's punish them. Let's slap their hands and say, you can't do that. Let's point out that it's against regulations. You're not going to fix that problem anyway if that's your mentality on how you go about that. If you don't fix that supply problem, you're not going to change that behavior. Those guys are going to go out there and get it done at any cost with whatever they can jury rig and and come up with like that. And if you don't understand that, you don't know what you need to know to facilitate safety. So we fixed that problem. Guess how we fixed it? With 40 more spanner wrenches that are no longer in the tool cage but out there in everybody's toolbox. By the way, the other thing the Marines told me, this is telling too, they said, by the way, if you check it out from the cage and it gets stolen, they take it out of your next paycheck and buy a new one for the cage. Well, these systems we put in place, boy, they're really powerful sometimes, aren't they? This is what we call facilitating, working with the influences on behaviors, not just the behaviors themselves. When you try to change a behavior, sometimes you're wagging the dog. That's a good old Texas saying. You know, the dog ought to wag the tail. You grab the tail and try to wag the dog. It doesn't work very well. You know, if you're trying to manage results, which we're all trying to do because we're managing lagging indicators, right? They're results. If you're going to manage results, you have to manage the process that produces those results. And we don't always remember that in safety. One of Deming's other famous quotes, he said, if you can't explain what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. So, what is the coach's contribution that they need to make? It's the game plan. What is your game plan for safety? I wrote a book just recently with Sean Galloway called Inside Strategy. We said, you know, almost all organizations have an outside strategy. How do we compete out there in the marketplace with our competitors? What's our competitive advantage? How do we go out there and get business and everything? What if you turn that same thinking internally and said, who are our internal customers? By the way, this is an interesting one to me too, a mindset change that I want to encourage. Do you think of your workers as the problem in safety? Or do you think of them as the customers of your safety process? You see, when you start thinking of them as customers, you start saying, am I meeting their needs? Am I marketing to what they do? Does my product add value to their performance? And when you start thinking that way, you start getting to that level of excellence and buy-in and ownership in safety. So, honestly, do you have a safety strategy? Or do you just have a bunch of safety programs you're throwing at the problem? I don't see a lot of people thinking really strategically about safety. And what is strategy? It's your game plan. How are you going to win? How are you going to win that war against accidents? And if your answers are old platitudes, oh, we're going to do safety training and we're going to do some good onboarding and we're going to tell people think before you act and be careful. Yeah, you're missing the whole point. What's your game plan? How do you win this war against accidents? Well, what if you pick out a few of them at a time, go defeat those, and then move on to others? This is the best strategy I've seen so far. You know, we tell people, well, go out there and do your best. Deming said it's not enough to do your best. You have to know what to do and then do your best. Peter Drucker, the controversial business school professor from Harvard Business School, who died just a few months ago, had a saying that I always liked too. He said, there's nothing in the world more useless than doing well that which shouldn't be done at all. You know how many people I see working on something in safety that's not going to make any difference and failing to work on the things that will? You know, strategy helps you prioritize those things and say, what's most important? What's going to have the biggest input? Those of you who are safety professionals, what if all your workers came to you and said, hey, safety person, we don't have unlimited time and resources and everything, but tell us one thing to focus on and we'll go out and do our very best to make it happen. What would you tell them to do? Would it go back to those old platitudes, think before you act, plan your jobs ahead, fill out your JSA, like that? Or would you really have an intelligent answer? You know what the answers were in some of the places that I go to? Look where you're going. Use good body mechanics when you lift something off the floor. Communicate meticulously to the people that you're working with. A number of things like that. So how do you target particular behaviors that can make a big difference in safety? Well, I think a lot of people target some things and totally miss out on others. So what we tend to target are the incident prevention behaviors. And you know, there's two kinds of them out there. There's the mandatory ones. Those are the ones that you have rules and procedures, government regulations and things like that. You don't ask your workers, pretty please do lockout, tagout. Lockout, tagout becomes a condition of employment, right? If you don't do lockout, tagout, you can't work here. Those are mandatory like that. Now, what are the discretionary ones? Have you identified those? How many of you have a rule that says you have to look where you're going? Or use good body mechanics when you lift? Or communicate meticulously? There's a lot of these things that are discretionary behaviors that are critically important to that last little gap in safety that you get to when you've done your best at everything you know how to do and you're wondering why you still have accidents that don't seem to be responding to them. This is what I tend to go in and discover in organizations. But just like there are mandatory and discretionary behaviors that can prevent accidents, there are mandatory or compliance issues, mandatory things that you have to do to build a safety culture. But if you try to build your safety culture by command and control, you're going to have very limited results. You'll have a safety culture, but it'll be one of those cultures of dependency that Covey was talking about. By the way, he was never talking about cultures, he's talking about individuals. But nonetheless, Bradley knows better than Stephen. But there are other things that will build engagement. You know, the word motivation has kind of gone away and the word engagement has taken its place in these last days. So how do you get people engaged? How do you get them actively engaged in your safety program? Because if they're not actively engaged, they're not going to feel a sense of ownership. So can you build that? Now, with all my criticism of them, the OSHA here in the U.S. actually put a program together back years ago that encouraged employee engagement. It was called the Voluntary Protection Program. And it formed a bunch of little committees and asked people to take part and everything else. You know, you don't have to do it their way. And there's other people who have done it other ways. And I wanted to show you an example. One of my clients who actually put something together to encourage their workers to participate in their program, gave them structure, empowerment, and resources to participate. Can you roll the video for me, please?
Team Domtar. Safety, excellence, awareness, and leadership. More than words, it's our mission. That's why we've created our SEAL Team initiatives. To challenge all employees to come together and improve the safety of our work environments and of our fellow workers. The SEAL teams were created to empower all of us with opportunities to lead the way towards a safer workplace, a safer Domtar. Each SEAL team has a specific mission, each with laser focus on their specific area to improve, all striving for one outcome, an injury-free workplace. That's what we call 810. 8 missions, 1 outcome, safety excellence. Domtar SEAL teams, the mission is clear. Keep people safe.
I've got several dozen examples like this that we've helped our client companies to develop, but this one I thought was especially effective in what they did. You saw their acronym that they came up with, SEAL, and they have their SEAL team, and they have their little logo, and each part of their logo is indicative of a different aspect of safety, and there's a team that works on that aspect of safety fairly independently. But then they all get together and collaborate for this one thing. By the way, if you didn't catch it also, I encouraged them to change one of the little things at the end of the video. It used to say 810, and it was 8 missions, 8 teams, 1 mission, 0 accidents. I hesitate to recommend to my clients that you set 0 accidents as a definition of safety excellence. It's one aspect of safety excellence, but it's not the only one. And just because you're at 0 accidents for some period of time doesn't really mean you're excellent in safety. You can get there by luck, you can get there by normal variation. I was at a site in Germany just a couple of years ago, and they had won the Chairman's Award for Safety. That means they had the best safety record of any of the 27 countries, 27 sites and that are all around the world in the different countries like that. The chairman of the board flew out and gave them this award and everything else. And I said, why did you call it the Chairman's Award? Just because the chairman gave it out? And they said, well, that's better than calling it the kiss of death. I said, what do you mean? They said, nobody's ever won it 2 years in a row. Now, what does that tell you? That everyone who's best every year cannot be best the next year. And one of my definitions of safety excellence is not just producing excellent results, but knowing exactly how you produce them and being able to repeat it again next year. And nobody in that company had ever done that. In 20 years, nobody had ever won the safety award twice in a row. Nobody had ever been best at safety 2 times in a row. So that tells me there's an element of luck in there still. Doesn't it you? Doesn't that suggest that to you? I mentioned the word motivation. I wanted to kind of end up my remarks here today with some thoughts on that. You know, we used to call motivation carrot and stick. You know, if you want to motivate somebody, dangle the carrot out in front of them and say, hey, if you'll do this, I'll give you this. Or if not, just beat them on the rear end and make them go on to the next thing. What we found out is that if what you're asking people to do is almost mindless, like buckle a seatbelt, the old carrot and stick theory actually works. If you want to reward people for buckling a seatbelt and punish them for not buckling a seatbelt, you will, to some degree, depending on how consistent you are and everything else with that, you will to some degree increase the frequency of that behavior. However, if what you're asking people to do requires even a modicum of cognitive thought, you want them to work out a problem, to reason out how the best situational answer to a particular thing, not only does carrot and stick not work, it actually hampers their performance. If you tell people, be creative and we'll give you a big reward. One of the things, an Australian software company offered a $10,000 basically reward for anybody who could come up with a new idea for software or fix a major bug in existing software. Guess what? 3 years later, nobody had claimed the $10,000 prize. So they started having something they called Fedex Days. And they said, on this day, you can work with whoever's willing to work with you on anything that you want to work on. The only condition is by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, you have to tell us what you came up with. Every one of their ideas for new software and fixes for bugs in old software has come from those Fedex Days ever since. Now, what's the difference? It's not a big monetary thing out there to say, hey, be creative and I'll give you money. It is true to these three principles, which are incredibly important: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Creative people need to have wiggle room in their thinking. They can't be locked into a specific, particular process to say, every time you have a problem, go through step 1, step 2, step 3. They've got to have a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of freedom to do it their way. Now, in this case, they gave them freedom to not only do it their way, but do whatever they wanted to do, as long as it was related to the company. Mastery. People are motivated by getting good at things. You know how many engineers I know that play guitar in a band on the weekend? And some of them pretty much suck at playing the guitar on the band of the weekend, but it's a challenge to them to get better at it and to work on that. You know, they're great engineers and they're lousy musicians, but they've got to get better at that guitar stuff. You know, we human beings are driven by wanting to be masters of things. The last part over here is the altruistic part. It's purpose. Why do you want to do it? Why is it important? What's really going to happen if you do this? What are the gains going to be? Interesting thing about purpose. Well, let me get to it as I go through this. What is autonomy? Again, it's not go do whatever you want to do like these folks do. They only do that, by the way. They've increased it now. They have 3 Fedex Days a year where their people can go work on virtually anything. Very, very innovative company over there. But what is this autonomy idea? It's not locking people down. And guess what locks people down? Micromanagement. I have a lot of managers who say, well, if I want to show them that I'm serious about safety, I got to tell them step by step what to do. That's exactly the way to undo what you're trying to accomplish. Micromanagement turns people off. They need some wiggle room. They need to be given what needs to happen and let them have some say in what they do. The most demotivated I was ever in my corporate career is when I had a boss who would say, well, go put this training program together or go put this safety program together. And then I knew he had a hidden agenda, and no matter what I came up with, we were going to change it to the way he wanted it to be. I had no autonomy in it whatsoever. He wanted to give me the impression of autonomy, but I knew it was going to be his way in the end. It's terribly demotivating. Mastery. How good can you get at something? Do you have a metric that tells you how good your people are at safety? Do you have a metric that tells you how good they are at their job? Do you have a job competency metric in your organization? I've got a lot of client companies right now that are going what I call off the cliff. What's that mean? It means that they've got a whole bunch of 25 to 35-year tenured employees who are about to retire, and the next group behind them are 2 to 5 year employees. Guess what's going to happen to the competency level of that organization over the next 2 or 3 years? Their average tenure is going to go from 25 to 5. And it's not just that they're losing a lot of old farts and getting a bunch of rugged new young guys in there. They're losing expertise. They're losing knowledge. You know how many industries don't have manuals like you do for everything that you do? Have you ever seen a manual on how to operate a refinery? But guess what? Those 25 and 35-year-old guys know when it caught on fire last time, when it blew up last time, how it happened, how they fixed it, what it's all about. Guess what happens when that expertise goes out the door? The competency level of the whole organization goes down. Mastery is an incredibly important aspect. If you're going to truly have these kind of excellent safety cultures you need, they can't be full of a bunch of dummies that don't know what they're doing. A good safety culture has to have competency at every level. So people need to know what they're doing. They need to become masters at what they're doing. Do you have continuous improvement opportunities for your workers in that? Purpose. Why do you want to do safety? Have you ever thought about that? Why do you want to do safety? Aren't you good enough? What happens when you start benchmarking well with the other people in your industry? Shouldn't you turn your attention to other things? Shouldn't you take it away from that? I mean, isn't good enough in safety? I'm seeing a number of good heads shake. No, it's not out there. You know, if you think good enough is good enough in safety, talk to your people that get injured every year. You know what? We only had 15 recordable accidents last year. We were really good in safety. Go talk to those 15 people and ask them how good you were in safety last year. You have seen the Dilbert cartoon, haven't you, where the pointy-haired boss is sitting in the boardroom and they've got a big chart on the wall like that, and he says, this year's goal is 0 accidents. He said, last year's goal was 15. We actually had to injure 8 people just to meet the goal, you know, to get us up to where our goal was last year. What safety ought to be about, and what safety is about in the most excellent performing organizations in the world is about people. Back in the 1960s, they formed a charity called Save the Children. There was a terrible famine in Africa, and children were starving to death in Africa. And they got what we called back in the 60s PSAs, public service announcements, which the television stations had to give you for free if you were a charitable organization. And they came on these PSA announcements and they said, children are starving in Africa, send money. Nobody sent any money. So they scratched their heads and they thought about that and they said, what can we do? And they came back with, and they said, well, we had the wrong spokesperson. We didn't have the right messenger for that thing. So they hired movie stars and athletes and very well-known people like that who came on TV and said, I'm a Studley athlete and children are starving in Africa, send money. Nobody sent money. I'm a movie star, send money. Nobody sent money. Okay. So they came back with a statistical approach. Numbers, that's going to get them, right? They came back and they said 1.7 million children are starving in Africa. Send money. Nobody sent money. Then on their fourth approach, they got this beautiful but obviously underfed and emaciated little girl, and they said, this little girl is starving in Africa. Send money. The money came in like crazy. From that point forward, you didn't give money to the fund, you sponsored a child. And you got a picture of that child that you were sponsoring, and they would write you letters and tell you how much your contribution had helped them and whatever it was they were doing. See, people don't care about causes. They don't care about numbers. They don't care about celebrities. They care about people. So what is your safety? What is the rationale behind your safety program? Oh, we'd like to get that 1.2 TRIR down to a 0.8 next year. Boy, that's going to motivate people. If you come back and say, you know what, we tried our best at safety last year, and regardless of our best efforts, we hurt 4 very important, very wonderful people in our company, that's not acceptable. Help us work on safety. You're going to do that. There's a man named Paul O'Neill who took over Alcoa back a number of years ago. A man got up out of the room when Paul O'Neill said, safety is going to be our #1 priority in Alcoa. A guy got up, walked to the telephone, called, and told all of his friends, sell all your Alcoa stock. They've put some stupid hippie in charge of the company. He's going to run it broke. If you had bought stock when Paul O'Neill became the president of the company and sold it when he left, you would have multiplied your profits by 1,200. And if whatever you invested in your stock, you would have already gotten back as dividends. Guess what happens when you put people first? People come out of the woodworks and try to help people. And when they try to help people, guess what else they help? Productivity, quality, all of these other things. You ever thought how closely tied those things are together? I had the opportunity to interview the CEOs and presidents of several of the Fortune 50 companies 2 years ago. I asked them, why do you insist on safety excellence from your suppliers and contractors? They all had the same two answers. I don't want to mix unsafe people with my people. And by the way, Terry, you know if they're not good at safety, there's other things they're not good at either. So guess what? The smartest, brightest people in the world look at safety not only as an indication of how good you are at safety, but how good you are at running your business. In my later years here, I have looked at my friends who became doctors and researchers, and they're trying to cure cancer and heart disease. And I started looking and I said, maybe I should have been one of those people. And then I looked at a statistic that I thought you'd find interesting. Guess what kills more people in the world between the age of 1 and 44? Heart disease or cancer? Neither one. It's accidental injuries. Guess what we're working on together here today, folks, you and I? We're working on the number one cause of the death of all people in the world between the ages of 1 and 44. You know what else? It's in the top 10 of all the other age groups. Even when you get to be 100 and you're dying of something, accidental injuries is in the top 10 causes of them out there. This is wonderful, altruistic, worthwhile things that we're doing. You're the people who care about it and are trying to make it happen, and I hope sincerely that the ideas I brought you here today will help you to do so. Thank you.